Hey everyone, it's Adam Rittenberg and Kyle Bonagura, co-hosts of the Unforgotten Season 3, Finding Dolores Wolf, and we're here to recap episode 2, Afraid of the Dark, that dropped a couple of days ago. Again, really appreciate all of your continued support for the podcast. And Kyle, this is an episode where we really get into the case, the disappearance of Dolores Wolf, and also the family dynamics that played into it. And a person that certainly surfaces quite a bit in this episode is Dolores and Carl Wolf's only daughter, Anna Wolf, who was the second of four children. And, we outlined this a bit, but I think it's worth saying that Anna was somebody who we did not speak to for the original ESPN story that we did on this case. But we were always hopeful, as we looked at do a podcast project, that maybe she would change her mind. And in talking to Paul Wolf and others, we got a sense that maybe she would be open to speaking with us. And fortunately, she was. And we really get into her recollections and her relationship with her father, Carl Wolf, and quite a bit here in this episode. Unfortunately, I was unable to speak with Anna that particular day, but you had a chance to talk with her extensively. What stood out about the lead up to that conversation and the actual conversation? Just some of the things that she told you as we put this project together.
Yeah, so the first time we spoke, it was really kind of going over what the project was, what we wanted the story to look like conceptually, right? And just saying, hey, there's a lot of people involved here. Anna was obviously a very important person here. Dolores was their mother, right? So we wanted to connect with everyone who had, insight into what happened, and she's central to the story. So I think, we kind of once we kind of had a chance to, build a little bit of rapport in that initial conversation, then she agreed to kind of do it on the record, right? And chat for the podcast. And so we ended up talking a few days later, talked for a few hours, and it was really emotional conversation. The subject matter that we got into ranged from, the happiest times to the worst of times and everywhere in between. And as we'll learn later in the podcast, her story is complicated. It was a complicated relationship with her mother. It was an even more complicated relationship with her father, and as a result of that, the rest of her family. But I thought Anna was, brave to share some of the stuff that she did. There's some very personal stuff that she got into with us, and I could kind of sense that she had a lot of this stuff bottled up for a long time and kind of wanted to share it, but wasn't kind of, it's because of how personal a lot of it is. It was a little bit of it took a leap of faith to open up to me that day and being willing to have some of that stuff shared with our listeners. So we really thank Anna for doing that. I think her honesty and in telling what she went through really adds to the understanding of the story, and I think that's really helpful for listeners.
No doubt. And as we were doing our reporting around this, and whenever she came up with the other relatives, there was always a bit of a pause or just a kind of a delicate tiptoeing around. There was something there that I'll be honest, if we didn't speak to her, I don't think the story would have been as full as it ended up being. She's an incredibly important part of the story, that relationship with Carl Wolf, certainly her relationship with her mother. But the other thing was that she was the first person to reach out the morning after Dolores Wolf disappeared on August 1st, 1979. That call was at 6:01 a.m., which was a very unusual time for her to be calling the house and Carl Wolf answering the phone. And so, that started kind of a whirlwind of phone calls and visits to the house and kind of the early stages of the investigation. And as you hear in that episode, she immediately suspected her father of being responsible, and so did her siblings, Carly and Tom Wolf. Paul was obviously very young at the time, and so Anna is involved from the very start and is involved all the way through this saga, which obviously lasts many, many more years after the initial disappearance. So she was a really important voice to include in this podcast. The other thing that we get into in episode 2 is just investigation and who was calling whom, whether it was Carl Wolf making notifications, whether it was law enforcement going out to his residence and beginning to collect some of the evidence that we learn about, mainly through the voice of Ron Heilemann, who was a detective in the area at that time and becomes a real central figure to this story. Kyle, as we talked with Ron, he was not someone we spoke to in person, and he was obviously in some he had some health issues at the time, but was very sharp in terms of remembering this case and exactly what he did in those initial days after Dolores went missing. What stood out most to you? Just hearing from Ron and regarding that evidence he collected in those first visits to the home on Hillcrest Drive with Carl Wolf.
Yeah, so it's 40 years later, right? 4 decades have passed since he lived those moments, and he was able to walk us step by step with incredible recall. I mean, starting with remembering that the first person that he spoke with was Anna. He remembers having a conversation with her immediately after getting pulled in on it, and her telling him that she was adamant that her father was responsible. The evidence is interesting as that tends to be in these sort of cases, right? You got you had the vivid memory of the fingers on the inside of the trunk. There's the blood on the blanket. There's the earring in the trunk. There was enough there for him to, it lines up with the theory that the family had relayed to him that Carl Wolf was the only person that needed to be looked at. He had a history of threats, and was a little bit evasive. Once the investigation started taking course, right? He ends up walking out of a lie detector test and eventually lawyers up, fairly quickly after expressing a willingness to cooperate. But yeah, Ron was a seasoned detective for a long time, and it was an incredible conversation that we had for him. We didn't have to ask a lot of questions. I mean, he was chronological start to finish, and it was the start of a relationship with this family that lasted for decades.
Yeah, I think the thoroughness of Ron Heilemann certainly comes across in the interview we had and in some of the sound that we played in episode two. And certainly the tension is beginning to build between the Rochas, Dolores's family, and law enforcement and Carl Wolf. And that tension will explode, we'll just put it that way, in episode three of Finding Dolores Wolf, This Way to the Murderer's House, which will be coming out this coming Monday. So you're certainly going to want to stay tuned for that episode. It's a wild one in many ways, and we're looking forward to that. Just as a reminder, we're on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, X, YouTube, obviously here, and please reach out to us with any questions, and we certainly appreciate your continued support of the Unforgotten Season 3, Finding Dolores Wolf. So that's all for now. It's Adam and Kyle. We'll see you next week.